A ginger cat at a rescue center finds out he's been adopted, then something unbelievable happens. What could make a quiet shelter cat suddenly frantic the moment he's finally adopted? The shocking truth isn't fear, but recognition, triggered by a dropped keychain that unlocks a 5-year-old mystery and an unbelievable family reunion. Subscribe, like, and listen to hear Leo's incredible story. The final signature, Frank Miller's slightly shaky script, dried on the adoption form. A quiet sense of completion settled over the small office at the Harmony Animal Shelter. Leo, the older ginger cat who had waited nearly a year, was officially going home. Sarah, the young volunteer who had championed him, beamed, handing the duplicate forms to Helen Miller. Helen tucked them into her purse, her gentle smile reflecting a mixture of hope and nervousness. Leo watched them from the sturdy plastic carrier beside the desk, anticipation thrumming beneath his usually calm demeanor. He didn't know exactly what home meant anymore, but the kindness radiating from the Millers felt like sunshine after a long winter. As Helen adjusted her purse strap, ready to leave, the strap snagged on the corner of the desk. The purse tilted, spilling its contents onto the worn linoleum floor, a wallet, lipstick, tissues, and a set of keys that landed with a distinct jangle. "Oh, Butterfingers," Helen murmured, bending to retrieve her things. The metallic clatter startled Leo. He flattened his ears momentarily, but as Helen scooped up the keys, something dangling from the ring caught the fluorescent light. A small, dark wooden charm carved into the unmistakable shape of a fish, worn smooth with time. Leo froze. His body went rigid inside the carrier. He stared at the wooden fish, his pupils dilating. A low growl rumbled in his chest, morphing into a high-pitched, desperate yowl unlike any sound Sarah had ever heard him make. He launched himself against the carrier door, scratching frantically at the mesh, his eyes locked on the keychain in Helen's hand. "Leo, what on earth?" Sarah exclaimed, startled by the sudden violence of his reaction. Frank Miller stepped back, bewildered. Is he okay? Maybe the noise scared him? But Helen wasn't looking at her husband or Sarah. She was looking at Leo, then down at the wooden fish keychain still clutched in her hand, then back at the frantic cat. Her face was drained of color. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by disbelief, then dawning, impossible hope. Leo had stopped scratching, but was now pressing his head hard against the mesh, trying desperately to reach the keychain, plaintive mews tearing from his throat. Slowly, her hand trembling, Helen lowered the keys towards the carrier door. Leo instantly stopped crying, nudging the wooden fish charm through the mesh with an intensity that was heartbreaking. Helen's breath hitched. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She looked up at her husband, her voice barely a whisper, thick with sudden emotion. "Frank, the fish, the scar on his ear. Oh my God, it can't be, can it?" The question hung in the stunned silence of the small office, heavy with the weight of years of grief and a sudden, unbelievable possibility. Leo hadn't always been Leo. For the first 2 years of his life, he'd been Marmaduke, the adored companion of a bright, artistic teenager named David Miller. David had found him as a stray kitten, nursed him patiently, and the two had become inseparable. David had even carved the little wooden fish charm for his cat's collar, a symbol of their shared inside jokes. But 5 years ago, David's life had been cut tragically short by a sudden illness, leaving his parents, Frank and Helen Miller, adrift in a sea of grief in their quiet Cedar Rapids, Iowa home. In the confusing aftermath, during the painful process of clearing out David's nearby apartment, Marmaduke, spooked and disoriented, had slipped out an open door and vanished. Frank and Helen searched for weeks, putting up posters, calling shelters, but the distinctive ginger cat with the slight tear in his left ear was gone, another painful loss compounding their sorrow. They eventually assumed the worst, another casualty of their son's passing. Life moved on as it must, but the silence in the Miller house felt heavier, the absence of their only child a constant presence. Frank retired from his accounting job. Helen tended her garden and volunteered at the library. They navigated their grief quietly, side by side, the subject of David and, by extension, Marmaduke, often too painful to breach. Years passed. The raw edges of sorrow softened, but the ache remained. Recently, feeling the weight of their quiet house more acutely, Helen had tentatively suggested adopting an older, calmer pet. Perhaps a cat needing a peaceful retirement home. Frank, initially hesitant, eventually agreed, hoping it might bring a small measure of comfort, a new focus for their shared affection. Meanwhile, the cat once known as Marmaduke was learning the harsh realities of stray life. He traveled, perhaps following familiar scents or simply driven by survival, eventually ending up miles away from Cedar Rapids. He learned to hunt, to hide, to fight for scraps. He bore the physical marks of his journey, the scar on his ear from a fight, a slight limp that sometimes surfaced in cold weather, a deep-seated wariness of sudden movements and loud noises. After 4 years fending for himself, a particularly harsh winter left him weak and starving. He was finally picked up by animal control in a town 50 miles from Cedar Rapids and transferred to the Harmony Animal Shelter. His microchip, implanted by David years ago, yielded only outdated information linked to David's old apartment address and number, leading nowhere. He was given a new name, Leo, treated for malnutrition, neutered, and placed up for adoption. He spent nearly a year at Harmony. He was a model resident, quiet, clean, non-demanding. Sarah, a college student volunteering between classes, developed a soft spot for the reserved ginger cat with the soulful green eyes. She'd spend extra time in his enclosure, talking softly, offering special treats, sensing a deep sadness beneath his calm exterior. She advocated for him, highlighting his gentle nature to potential adopters, but most visitors were drawn to the tumbling energy of the kittens. Leo waited patiently, observing the world through the wire mesh, perhaps dimly remembering a time of warmth and belonging, but mostly just existing. Until the Millers arrived. There was something about the quiet couple, their gentle voices, the way Mrs. Miller's hand felt familiar when she tentatively stroked his head through the bars. He felt a flicker of something dormant, a sense of safety he hadn't felt in years. When they chose him, when Sarah brought the carrier with his name, Leo, written on it, a profound sense of hope stirred within him. He didn't know these people, not consciously, but some deep instinct told him this was right. This was his chance. This decision by the Millers, born of their own quiet need for companionship and unknowingly setting the stage for an impossible reunion, was the inciting incident that would unravel 5 years of loss and separation in one unbelievable moment triggered by the jangle of dropped keys. The journey from being Marmaduke, beloved pet, to Leo, overlooked shelter resident, had been arduous. After slipping out of David's apartment amidst the chaos and grief following his death, the cat found himself utterly lost. The familiar scents were wrong. The comforting presence of his boy was gone. Instinct drove him, but confusion reigned. He traveled, driven by hunger and a vague feline sense of searching, though for what, he no longer knew. He learned quickly that the world outside David's safe embrace was harsh. Other strays fought viciously over scraps behind restaurants. Humans were unpredictable. Some offered food, others threw rocks or yelled. Cars were terrifying metal beasts that roared past, narrowly missing him more than once. He learned to stay hidden during the day, scavenging under the cover of darkness. He hunted mice and unlucky birds, his ginger coat providing poor camouflage against urban landscapes, making stealth essential. He endured scorching summers sheltering under parked cars and freezing winters huddled in abandoned sheds or drain pipes. The scar on his ear came from a brutal fight with a large feral tomcat over a half-eaten burger. His slight limp emerged after a fall from a fence while escaping a chasing dog. He survived, but the gentle trust of his kittenhood was buried deep beneath layers of necessary caution. Meanwhile, Frank and Helen Miller navigated their own landscape of survival, the landscape of grief. The first year after David's death was a blur of condolences, legalities, and numb disbelief. The second year brought a sharp, aching awareness of the silence, the empty spaces David left behind. They kept his bedroom largely untouched, a shrine filled with his artwork, his books, his clothes still holding a faint trace of his scent. Helen carried the wooden fish keychain David had proudly presented to her after carving it for Marmaduke. "So you always have a piece of him with you, Mom," he'd said, attaching it to her own keys, a tangible link to both her son and his lost companion. They rarely spoke of Marmaduke. The double loss felt too acute. They assumed he'd met a grim fate, another victim of the upheaval that had shattered their lives. They settled into a quiet routine, their shared sorrow an invisible wall around them. The suggestion to adopt a pet years later was Helen's tentative attempt to breach that wall, to invite a small measure of new life back into their quiet home. The adoption process for Leo at Harmony Shelter moved forward with quiet anticipation. Sarah ensured Leo had a final checkup with the shelter vet, who noted his generally good health despite his age and history. She gathered his few possessions, a worn piece of flannel blanket he favored in his enclosure. She gave him extra pets and whispered encouragement as she prepared him for the Millers' arrival on that fateful Saturday. "You be a good boy, Leo," she murmured, scratching his favorite spot behind his scarred ear. "You deserve this happy ending." When the Millers arrived, Leo felt that familiar flicker of connection again, a strange sense of rightness about these quiet, sad-eyed humans. He allowed Frank to stroke him, leaned into Helen's touch. He walked calmly into the carrier Sarah presented. As Sarah went over the adoption paperwork with the Millers, explaining Leo's known history, or lack thereof, his dietary needs, his reserved personality, Helen absent-mindedly fingered the wooden fish keychain attached to the purse strap, resting on her lap. Leo, watching from the carrier, noticed the familiar shape, the dark wood. A vague, unsettling memory stirred, a scent, a feeling, but it remained just below the surface, elusive. There was a brief moment of hesitation. Frank quietly asked Helen if she was sure about adopting an older cat with an unknown past. Maybe a kitten would be easier. Helen looked at Leo, met his calm green gaze, and nodded firmly. No, Frank, it feels right. He feels right. The papers were signed. The fee was paid. Helen reached into her purse for the donation, and the keys tumbled to the floor, triggering the cascade of memory and recognition that would change everything. The stage was meticulously set, unknowingly, for the unbelievable to happen. Frank, look. Helen's voice trembled as she held the keychain, still attached to her keys, near the carrier's mesh door. Leo Marmaduke frantically pushed against the wire, desperate to touch the small wooden fish, his purrs now mixed with plaintive, recognizing mews. Frank Miller, practical, grounded Frank, stared, his initial skepticism battling the impossible evidence before him. He remembered David spending hours in the garage, carefully carving that exact fish shape from a piece of driftwood, sanding it smooth, presenting it proudly for Marmaduke's collar. He remembered the cat batting playfully at it. He looked closely at the cat in the carrier, the vibrant ginger fur, slightly muted by age and hardship, but undeniably the same shade, the specific set of his green eyes, and the scar. David had been heartbroken when Marmaduke came home with that torn ear after a neighborhood scuffle years ago. It was small, faded, but undeniably there. The scar, Helen, Frank whispered, his own voice catching. It's the same ear, the same spot. Sarah, meanwhile, had rushed back to the office computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up Leo's intake records from nearly a year ago. She scanned the details, her eyes widening. Okay, she read aloud, her voice breathless. Subject, Leo, est arrival, May 17th, previous year. Species, feline. Breed, domestic shorthair. Color, orange tabby. Sex, male, neutered. Estimated age on arrival, approx. 6 years. She paused, calculating. That would make him 7 now. How old was Marmaduke when he went missing? He was 2, Helen choked out. David got him as a tiny kitten, 2 plus the 5 years he's been gone. That makes him 7. Sarah continued reading from the intake notes. Distinguishing marks. Minor scarring, notch upper left ear pinna. Temperament. Initially wary, non-aggressive. Health. Underweight upon arrival. Signs of previous minor injuries. Slight stiffness of rear right leg in cold weather noted by vet. Otherwise, healthy. Every detail clicked into place with stunning, heart-wrenching accuracy. The age, the color, the distinctive scar, the slight stiffness Frank now vaguely remembered David mentioning after Marmaduke had a tumble. It wasn't just like Marmaduke, it was Marmaduke. Helen sank into the nearby chair, tears streaming freely now, not just tears of sadness, but of overwhelming shock and joy. Marmaduke, oh my poor boy, you've been out there all this time, all alone? She spoke directly to the cat, who responded with a soft, searching meow, his frantic energy softening slightly now that the object of his recognition was close and steady. Frank knelt beside the carrier, peering in, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Marmaduke, remember David, boy? The cat let out a soft chirp, a sound David used to elicit with a specific scratch under the chin. This was the absolute turning point. The quiet adoption of an older shelter cat named Leo instantly transformed into the miraculous, unbelievable recovery of Marmaduke, their late son's cherished companion, a living link to the boy they had lost 5 years ago. The atmosphere in the small office shifted from quiet procedure to profound, shared emotion. Sarah wiped her own eyes, witnessing the most incredible reunion she'd ever seen at the shelter. The goal was no longer simply giving an abandoned cat a comfortable home for his remaining years. It was about welcoming back a piece of their hearts, a furry family member presumed lost forever. It was about reconnecting with their son through the creature he had loved so dearly. The adoption papers signed for Leo suddenly felt like documents of fate, solidifying not a new beginning, but a long-delayed homecoming. The sense of wonder, of disbelief, of a miracle unfolding in a humble animal shelter was palpable. Marmaduke was home. The car ride back to the Miller's house was filled with a surreal mix of tears, hushed whispers, and the soft sounds of Marmaduke occasionally bumping against the carrier door. Helen held the carrier securely on her lap, one hand resting gently on the mesh, murmuring to the cat, calling him by the name he hadn't heard in 5 long years. Frank drove slowly, carefully, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind reeling from the emotional impact of the afternoon. Letting Marmaduke out of the carrier in their quiet living room was a moment thick with anticipation. Would he remember the house? Would they know how to navigate this? Caring for a cat who was both a new beginning and a poignant living reminder of their deepest loss. Marmaduke stepped out cautiously, tail low, sniffing the air, his shelter-honed wariness momentarily overriding any flicker of recognition. He explored the room slowly, meticulously, his nose twitching, taking in the scent of the furniture, the rugs, the humans who watched him with bated breath. He sniffed at the leg of an armchair, paused, then rubbed his cheek against it, a spot where Helen often sat. He moved towards the fireplace, paused again, then deliberately bypassed the new cat bed they'd optimistically bought and curled up on the worn, braided rug directly in front of the hearth, a spot where he used to lie watching the flames with David on winter evenings. A small sign, but it sent a jolt of recognition through both Frank and Helen. The following days and weeks were a period of gentle readjustment for everyone. Marmaduke, while clearly remembering certain spots and responding with soft chirps to his old name, also carried the invisible scars of his 4 years adrift. He startled violently at loud noises, a dropped pan, a car backfiring outside, sometimes bolting under the nearest piece of furniture and refusing to emerge for hours. He ate ravenously, possessively, as if fearing the food might disappear, a habit ingrained by years of scarcity. He remained wary of sudden movements, though he never showed aggression, only a deep-seated caution. The Millers learned to move slowly, speak softly, anticipate his triggers. They met his needs with infinite patience, understanding that healing took time. Their quiet house gradually adapted to his presence. They found themselves talking more, sharing rediscovered memories of David and Marmaduke, the cat's presence acting as a catalyst for conversations they hadn't had in years. Helen would show Marmaduke old photos of David, and the cat would often rub his head against the frames, purring softly. Frank found himself leaving the door to David's bedroom, untouched for 5 years, slightly ajar. One afternoon, Helen found Marmaduke curled asleep on David's old quilt at the foot of the bed, a sight that brought both tears and a sense of peace. Yet there were difficult moments. The dark night of the soul arrived during a severe thunderstorm about a month after Marmaduke came home. The crashing thunder sent the cat into a state of sheer panic. He wedged himself deep under the guest room bed, trembling uncontrollably, refusing all coaxing or treats. Helen sat on the floor nearby for hours, murmuring soothing words, feeling helpless. Doubts surfaced. Was this too much for him? Had the trauma of his stray years damaged him irrevocably? Was there hope for a peaceful companion? And underlying it, the sharp pang of grief? Was caring for Marmaduke simply reopening the wound of losing David, making the pain fresh again? Frank found her there later, quietly crying. He sat beside her, putting an arm around her shoulders. "It's okay, Helen," he said softly. "He's safe now. We'll get through this, all of us." Their shared commitment to the cat, to navigating the complexities of his return, strengthened their own bond, forging a new path through their grief together. They wouldn't give up on Marmaduke, just as he, somehow, hadn't given up on finding his way back. Several months had passed. Marmaduke had settled into a rhythm, the sharp edges of his trauma softening, replaced by a quiet confidence and deep affection for the Millers. He still startled at loud noises but recovered more quickly. He ate normally now, trusting the food bowl would always be refilled. He sought out laps and sunny windowsills, his stray instincts gradually yielding to the comforts of home. Yet, Helen sometimes felt a lingering question, a whisper of doubt about the depth of his memory, the true extent of their reconnection across the lost years. The emotional climax arrived unexpectedly on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the anniversary of David's passing. Helen felt the familiar weight of sadness settle over her. She retreated to David's room, not wanting Frank to see her tears. She sat on the edge of her son's bed, clutching the small wooden fish keychain, running her thumb over its smooth surface, lost in memories. The house was silent, except for the ticking clock downstairs. After a few minutes, she heard a soft scratching at the door. She opened it to find Marmaduke waiting patiently. He walked directly into the room, something he rarely did unless she or Frank was already there, hopped onto the bed beside her, and looked intently at the keychain in her hand. He let out a soft, questioning meow. Hesitantly, Helen held it out. Marmaduke sniffed it delicately, then rubbed his cheek against her hand, against the wooden fish, with a forcefulness that spoke volumes. Then he did something truly extraordinary. He climbed onto her lap, settled himself comfortably, an intimacy he reserved for moments of deep trust, and began to purr, a sound deeper and more resonant than his usual contented rumble. He looked up, meeting Helen's tear-filled eyes, and slowly, deliberately, lifted a paw and gently touched her cheek, right where a tear was escaping. He held it there for a moment, his gaze steady, his purr vibrating through her. It wasn't just a random cat gesture. It felt like intentional comfort, a profound acknowledgement of her sorrow, a bridge across the silence, connecting past and present, mother and son, through the quiet empathy of the animal they both had loved. In that moment, all doubt vanished. He remembered, he understood, he was home, truly home, and in his own way, he was helping her heal. That quiet moment on David's bed marked the final closing of the circle. Marmaduke wasn't just a reminder of their loss, He became an integral part of their healing, a living embodiment of enduring love and improbable second chances. His presence filled the house, not with sadness, but with a gentle, comforting warmth. His ginger fur adorned the furniture. His soft purr became the new soundtrack to their quiet evenings. Frank and Helen found a new rhythm to their retirement, centered around Marmaduke's needs and comforts. They took joy in his returning playfulness, chasing dust bunnies, batting at dangling cords with the enthusiasm of a younger cat. They cherished his quiet companionship, the way he'd greet them at the door or curl up between them on the sofa while they watched television. He became a local celebrity in their quiet neighborhood, the miracle cat, whose story neighbors loved to hear. Sarah from the shelter visited occasionally, marveling at the transformation from the reserved Leo to the confident, affectionate Marmaduke. They kept David's room as it was, but it no longer felt solely like a shrine to loss. It was also Marmaduke's occasional sanctuary, a place where past and present coexisted peacefully. The wooden fish keychain remained on Helen's key ring, no longer just a reminder of what was lost, but a symbol of what had been miraculously found. Life for the Millers wasn't the same as it was before David died. The scar of his absence would always remain, but it was no longer defined solely by that absence. It was enriched by the presence of Marmaduke, the ginger cat who had navigated years of hardship to find his way back, guided by memory and fate. The unbelievable event at the rescue center had done more than just reunite a cat with his family. It had reignited hope, offered profound comfort, and proven that sometimes the most broken hearts can begin to mend in the most unexpected and wonderfully furry ways. Life for the Millers wasn't the same as it was before David died. The scar of his absence would always remain. But it was no longer defined solely by that absence. It was enriched by the presence of Marmaduke, the ginger cat who had navigated years of hardship to find his way back, guided by memory and fate. Frank, quieter in his grief than Helen, found his own solace in the cat's steady presence. He took over the morning feeding routine, talking softly to Marmaduke as he measured out the kibble, sometimes feeling a fleeting echo of his son doing the same thing years ago. He even started sketching again, something he hadn't done since David's passing, often using the sleeping cat as his subject. Marmaduke, too, seemed to reach his own final stage of healing. One evening, during a distant rumble of thunder that previously would have sent him hiding, he merely lifted his head, looked towards Helen for reassurance, and then, seemingly satisfied by her calm presence, tucked his nose back under his paw and continued sleeping peacefully on the rug. That quiet display of trust felt like a final victory over the fear that had shadowed him for so long. His playful side emerged more fully, too. He'd occasionally ambush Frank's feet with gentle batting paws, or chase sunbeams across the floor with surprising agility, fleeting moments of pure cat joy that brought easy laughter back into the house. When the Millers' young grandchildren came to visit, shyly at first, Marmaduke allowed their gentle strokes, bridging another generation with his quiet tolerance and warmth, a furry ambassador of his first young master's kind spirit. The wooden fish keychain remained on Helen's key ring, now rubbed even smoother by her frequent touch. No longer just a reminder of what was lost, but a symbol of what had been miraculously found and the enduring strength of love. The unbelievable event at the rescue center had done more than just reunite a cat with his family. It had reignited hope, offered profound comfort, and proven that sometimes the most broken hearts can begin to mend in the most unexpected and wonderfully furry ways. Through the quiet language of shared grief and patient affection, they had all, in their own ways, found their way home. A weeping stray cat brings his dying baby to a man. What he does next is unbelievable. What could make a hardened stray tomcat seemingly weep on a stranger's doorstep? He brings a heartbreaking offering, forcing a reclusive man into an unbelievable choice. The shocking reason behind the cat's desperation will change everything. Subscribe, like, and listen to the full story of unexpected fatherhood and improbable rescue. The sound pierced the comfortable quiet of Walter Harrison's evening reading, a thin, high-pitched wail that seemed to scrape against the stillness of the suburban Ohio night. It wasn't the usual nocturnal catfight or the screech of tires on asphalt. This was different. Raw, desperate, annoyed at the interruption, Walter lowered his history book, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time, seeming to emanate directly from his front porch, accompanied by frantic scratching at the door. More irritated than concerned, Walter heaved himself out of his worn leather armchair. He wasn't fond of interruptions, especially not from the neighborhood strays he occasionally saw slinking through his meticulously kept yard. He pulled back the curtain, slightly peering out. What he saw made him freeze. There on his doormat sat a large, battle-scarred orange tomcat. Its fur was ruffled, its body tense, but it wasn't the cat's appearance that was shocking. It was the sound it was making. A continuous, choked, miserable yowling that sounded eerily like weeping. Tears weren't literally streaming, of course, but the sheer anguish in the sound was palpable, unnerving, and the cat wasn't alone. At its paws lay a minuscule scrap of fur, barely recognizable as a kitten. It was terrifyingly still, its tiny limbs limp, its color somehow wrong. As Walter watched, frozen in disbelief, the big tomcat nudged the lifeless-looking form gently, with his nose pushing it fractionally closer to Walter's door. Then the tomcat looked up, its green eyes locking onto Walter's through the window. The yowling softened slightly into a desperate, pleading meow, a sound that seemed to hold an impossible question. Walter had never seen anything like it. A tomcat, notoriously solitary and often aggressive, apparently grieving, deliberately bringing its dying offspring to a human's doorstep. It defied everything he thought he knew about animal behavior. The kitten looked impossibly small, impossibly still. Was it already dead? Why bring it here? Why to him, a man known for his privacy and his distinct lack of engagement with neighborhood pets? The desperate eyes of the father cat held him captive, demanding a response to a plea. Walter didn't fully understand, but couldn't possibly ignore. Walter Harrison cultivated solitude like some people cultivated prize-winning roses, since his wife Eleanor had passed away 5 years prior after a long illness. His life had contracted, settling into the quiet, predictable rhythms of retirement. 68 years old, a former high school history teacher known for his stern demeanor and exacting standards, he now filled his days with reading, maintaining his neat brick house in their quiet Midwest subdivision, and taking solitary walks. He exchanged polite, brief greetings with neighbors, but discouraged casual conversations. Most people in the neighborhood considered him reserved, perhaps even a bit grumpy, a private man content in his orderly, self-contained world. He wasn't unfriendly, just detached animals, particularly the free-roaming cats that sometimes used his flower beds as litter boxes were generally filed under minor annoyances. He'd certainly noticed the big orange tomcat before, a frequent phantom haunting the edges of yards at twilight, bearing the nicks and scars of a life lived rough. Walter had mentally labeled him the General for his imposing size and seemingly territorial nature, but had never interacted with him beyond occasionally shooing him away from the bird feeder. He had no pets of his own. The silence left by Eleanor felt too vast to try and fill with the cheerful chaos of an animal companion. So finding that same imposing tomcat essentially prostrate with grief on his doorstep, presenting him with a dying kitten, was profoundly jarring. Walter stood paralyzed for a long moment, the cat's desperate gaze pinning him. He could see the kitten more clearly now, newborn, impossibly tiny, its fur damp and dark, its chest utterly still. It looked cold, lifeless. A flicker of annoyance warred with an unexpected surge of something else. Pity, responsibility. The tomcat, Leo the name surfaced, replacing the General, nudged the kitten again, then let out another heart-wrenching yowl, looking directly at Walter. It wasn't just a random act. The cat had chosen his door, his attention. It was a deliberate, desperate appeal for help from a creature pushed beyond the limits of its own ability to cope. The raw, undeniable desperation in that animal's eyes became the inciting incident. It shattered Walter's carefully constructed wall of detachment. All his ingrained reserve, his preference for non-involvement, evaporated in the face of such primal grief and appeal. He couldn't analyze it. He could only react. With a suddenness that surprised even himself, he wrenched open the front door. The cool night air hit his face. Leo flinched back slightly but held his ground, eyes wide. "All right," Walter heard himself say, his voice rough. "All right, cat." He stooped down, his movement stiff but decisive. Ignoring the wary father cat, he gently, carefully scooped up the tiny, cold body of the kitten. It weighed almost nothing, felt terrifyingly fragile. "Okay," he repeated more to himself this time, straightening up. "Let's see what we can do." His goal was immediate, instinctive, and utterly uncharacteristic. Get this kitten, help figure out the rest later. He turned, leaving the door ajar for the stunned tomcat, and strode towards the garage and his car keys. The drive to the all-night emergency veterinary clinic in Westerville, the next town over, was a blur of adrenaline and anxiety. Walter placed the kitten hastily wrapped in a clean dish towel inside a small cardboard box on the passenger seat. He turned the heater up high, hoping the warmth might help. He kept glancing over, watching for any sign of life, any flicker of movement in the dim dashboard light. There was none. The kitten remained terrifyingly still, its tiny form barely making an imprint in the towel. "Hang on, little fella." Walter found himself murmuring the sound strange in the quiet car. Just hang on. He drove faster than usual, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind racing. What was he even doing? He knew nothing about kittens, especially sick ones. What if it was already too late? What about the father cat, Leo? He'd left the door open, but had the cat followed? Or was it still waiting on his porch? The impulsive decision to act now felt heavy, with unforeseen consequences. He thought briefly, guiltily, about the potential cost. Emergency vet visits weren't cheap. He lived comfortably enough on his pension and Social Security, but unexpected large expenses required careful consideration, something he hadn't done it all. He pushed the thought away. He'd deal with that later, right now. Only the small, cold life beside him mattered. The clinic waiting room was sparsely populated at this late hour. A young woman crying softly over a listless dog. An older couple looking anxious with a cat carrier. Walter felt awkward out of place, clutching his makeshift cardboard box. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes, took his information efficiently, but couldn't hide her surprise when she saw the minuscule kitten. A vet tech quickly assessed the situation and whisked the kitten away to the treatment area. Walter was left to wait. Pacing the small room, the antiseptic smell stinging his nostrils, he felt a familiar pang of helplessness, the same feeling that had washed over him during Eleanor's final weeks in the hospital hospice wing. He hated this feeling, this powerlessness in the face of suffering. After what felt like an age, a veterinarian appeared. She introduced herself as Ärztin Chen, her expression professional but kind. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Ärztin Chen. We're working on the little one now." Is he alive?" Walter asked, his voice tight. Ärztin Chen hesitated. "Technically, yes, but barely. Mr. Harrison, he's severely hypothermic. His body temperature was dangerously low. He's also profoundly hypoglycemic, meaning his blood sugar is critically low and he's barely breathing. Honestly, he presented as nearly deceased." She explained the immediate intervention's placement in a specialized incubator with oxygen warming protocols, an emergency dose of dextrose administered directly into the bone marrow. Because his veins were too collapsed for an IV respiratory support, we're essentially trying to pull him back from the brink. She said frankly, "It looks like classic fading kitten syndrome, possibly complicated by exposure or a congenital defect. Kittens this young, especially without a mother's constant warmth and milk, are incredibly fragile." Walter absorbed this, his earlier anxieties solidifying into grim reality. Fading kitten syndrome, what causes that? "It can be a number of things," Ärztin Chen explained patiently. "Infections, congenital problems, inadequate mothering. If the queen is sick or inexperienced, environmental factors like cold. Sometimes we never know the exact cause. The key is immediate intensive supportive care to try and reverse the downward spiral." Then came the inevitable complication. The cost. Ärztin Chen outlined the necessary next steps. Continued incubator care, possible IV fluids. If they could get a line and medications round-the-clock monitoring, the intensive care required is significant. "Mr. Harrison," she stated, handing him an estimate sheet, "and I have to be honest, even with all this, his chances of survival are very, very slim. Perhaps less than 20%. Walter stared at the estimate, the numbers blurring slightly. It was a substantial amount, far more than he'd vaguely anticipated, enough to make a serious dent in his carefully managed retirement savings. He looked at Ärztin Chen's compassionate but realistic expression. He thought of the tiny scrap of life fighting in the back room. He thought of the big orange tomcat's desperate weeping plea on his doorstep. The logical part of his brain, the part that managed his budget and valued order, screamed caution. This was a stray kitten, likely doomed, belonging to a stray tomcat he didn't even know. It was throwing good money after bad. It was illogical. But logic felt utterly irrelevant right now. Walter sat heavily on the hard plastic chair in the waiting room, the estimate sheet clutched in his hand. Erston Chen had retreated briefly to check on another patient, leaving him alone with the numbers and the crushing weight of the decision, less than 20% chance. Significant cost logic dictated he cut his losses, thank the vet for her efforts, and let nature take its course. It would be the sensible thing to do. He leaned his head back against the cool wall, closing his eyes. Why had that cat come to him? He barely tolerated strays. He hadn't put out food, hadn't encouraged them in any way. Yet Leo had singled out his door, his house, as a place of last resort. Had the cat sensed something, or was it just random desperation? His mind drifted back unbidden to Eleanor. She had loved animals, all animals. Their house had always had a cat, usually a rescue, until the last one passed away shortly before Eleanor herself got sick. He remembered her patience, her unwavering belief in second chances, her gentle hands nursing sick birds found in the garden. He recalled with a pang of old guilt a time years ago when he'd dismissed her concern over a stray dog hanging around the neighborhood, telling her not to get involved, that it wasn't their problem. The dog had disappeared a few days later. He never knew what became of it. But Eleanor's quiet disappointment had lingered. "Every life has value, Walter," she used to say, "even the small ones, especially the small ones." He opened his eyes. The waiting room felt cold, sterile. He looked at the closed door leading to the treatment area, behind which a tiny life hung by the barest thread. He thought of Leo, the father cat waiting somewhere out in the night, having placed his last hope in the hands of a gruff stranger. Walking away now felt like a betrayal, not just of the kitten or the father cat, but of Eleanor, of the better man she had always encouraged him to be. This internal struggle, the confrontation between his ingrained reserve and a resurgent sense of compassion fueled by memory and the immediacy of the crisis, was the midpoint. He was caught between the logical path of non-involvement and the emotionally demanding path of commitment. Erston Chen returned her expression, questioning but patient. "Mr. Harrison, have you had a chance to think?" Walter stood up, the estimate sheet crumpled slightly in his fist. The doubt was still there, a cold knot of pragmatism in his gut. But something else, something warmer and stronger, had taken root. Maybe it was Eleanor's imagined approval. Maybe it was the haunting image of Leo's eyes. Maybe it was simply the refusal to let that tiny spark of life extinguish without a fight. The turning point was absolute. He looked Erston Chen straight in the eye. "Doctor," he said, his voice clearer and firmer than it had felt in years, "I want you to do everything possible, everything, incubator medications, monitoring, whatever it takes. Don't hold back because of the cost. I'll cover it." Erston Chen raised her eyebrows slightly, clearly surprised by his unwavering decisiveness, perhaps having expected hesitation or negotiation based on the prognosis. "Are you sure, Mr. Harrison? The odds are very poor, and the cost will likely increase if he requires prolonged care." "I'm sure," Walter stated simply. He took out his wallet, produced his credit card. "Do whatever is necessary. Just give him every chance you can." As Erston Chen took the card to process the initial deposit, Walter felt a strange sense of release, almost lightness. He had stepped far outside his comfort zone, made a decision based purely on empathy rather than logic, committed significant resources to a near-hopeless cause. It was reckless, perhaps, foolish, but as he sank back onto the waiting room chair, prepared for a long vigil, it also felt undeniably right. He had accepted the burden, embraced the uncertainty. He was now fully invested in Pip's fight for life. There was no going back. The next 48 hours were a tense vigil. Walter spent most of that time either at the clinic, sitting quietly near the treatment area where he could occasionally glimpse the incubator holding Pip, or at home, restlessly pacing, unable to focus on his books or his usual routines. Sleep came only in short, fitful bursts. Pip's condition remained critical, but stable. He was responding, albeit minimally, to the supportive care. His temperature held steady in the incubator, his blood sugar stabilized with the continuous dextrose, and his breathing, supported by oxygen, seemed fractionally less labored. Ärztin Chen stressed that he was far from out of the woods. The next few days would be crucial. Any small infection, any failure to start absorbing nutrients could tip the balance irrevocably. Meanwhile, back at Walter's house, another drama unfolded quietly. Leo, the father cat, reappeared the morning after Walter had brought Pip to the clinic. He didn't come to the door this time, but sat at the edge of the driveway watching the house with an air of anxious waiting. Walter's heart went out to him. Driven by his newfound commitment, he put out a bowl of fresh water and a plate of canned cat food near the garage, a spot somewhat sheltered from the street. Leo approached the food cautiously, only after Walter had retreated inside, gobbling it down quickly before melting back into the shadows of the neighbor's shrubbery. Walter continued putting out food and water daily. He started talking to Leo from the porch, using a low, calm voice, just letting the cat get used to his presence again, associating him now not with taking the kitten away, but with providing sustenance. Leo remained wary, keeping his distance, but he stopped running away entirely. He seemed to understand on some feline level that this human was now connected to his kitten's fate. Walter began preparing for the possibility, however remote, of Pip coming home. He cleared a space in his quiet study, setting up a large dog crate lined with soft towels and a low-wattage heating lamp clamped safely to the side. He purchased kitten milk replacer, KMR bottles, syringes, and other supplies Ärztin Chen recommended, feeling vaguely bewildered by the array of neonatal paraphernalia. His neat, orderly house was slowly being disrupted by the potential arrival of a fragile new life. Neighbors noticed the changes. Mrs. Gable from next door commented on the cat food bowls. "Feeding the strays now? Walter didn't think you were the type," she'd said, not unkindly, over the fence. Walter had merely grunted non-committally. Another neighbor saw him coming home late from the vet clinic and asked if everything was all right. Walter found himself awkwardly explaining the situation, feeling strangely protective of both the kitten and the father cat. His private life was suddenly unexpectedly becoming less private. Pip's progress continued at an agonizingly slow pace. He began to show slightly more responsiveness, moving his head weakly towards warmth. Occasionally making tiny sucking motions, Ärztin Chen managed to get a minuscule IV catheter placed, allowing for better hydration and nutritional support. Each small improvement felt like a miracle. Each static day filled Walter with gnawing anxiety. He learned to interpret the subtle nuances in Ärztin Chen's updates, the difference between stable and slightly improved, the significance of a fractional weight gain. Leo, too, seemed to be waiting. He spent more time near Walter's house, sometimes dozing under the porch bushes, always watching. Walter started leaving the garage door cracked open a few inches during the day, creating a potential shelter from the elements. He saw Leo investigate it once or twice, but not linger. The trust was building, but slowly a setback occurred a week into Pip's treatment. He developed aspiration pneumonia, likely from inhaling a tiny amount of formula during a feeding, a common and dangerous complication in weak kittens. He needed stronger antibiotics, more intensive respiratory support. Erston Chen was guarded. "This is serious, Walter. It could go either way." Walter felt his hope plummet. Had he brought Pip this far only to lose him now? He spent that night at the clinic, sitting vigil outside the treatment room, feeling utterly drained. He thought about giving up, about the mounting costs, about the sheer emotional toll. This dark night of the soul tested his resolve to its core, but Pip, against all odds, rallied again. The new antibiotics started working. His breathing slowly eased. He was Erston Chen, declared a few days later, a tiny fighter. Finally, after nearly 3 weeks of intensive care, the vet delivered the news Walter had barely dared to hope for. Pip was stable enough to come home. He was still incredibly fragile, would require meticulous care and feeding, but he had survived the critical phase. Walter felt a profound wave of relief, quickly followed by a fresh surge of anxiety. Could he really do this? Could he provide the constant care this fragile creature needed? And how would Leo react to having his kitten back? But in this strange new environment, the final preparations for Pip's homecoming felt momentous, charged with both hope and apprehension. The stage was set for the climax, the reunion of father and son under Walter's uncertain but committed care. Bringing Pip home felt like handling spun glass. Walter carried the small carrier equipped with a heated pad and soft blankets into his study. His movements slow and deliberate. Pip was asleep inside a tiny orange ball barely larger than Walter's fist. His breathing shallow but regular. Walter had already set up the large crate as Pip's safe haven, warm and secure. He hadn't seen Leo yet that morning, and worried the tomcat might have been spooked by the final preparations. But as Walter carefully placed the carrier near the open crate in the study, he heard a soft chirp from the doorway. Leo stood there tense but watchful, his green eyes fixed on the carrier. He had clearly been waiting. Perhaps sensing the shift in the house's atmosphere, Walter knelt beside the carrier, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. He spoke softly to both cats. "Okay, Leo, he's home. He's very weak, but he's home." He slowly unlatched the carrier door but made no move to take Pip out. He left the next step entirely up to the cats. Leo approached cautiously, sniffing the air, his body low to the ground. He circled the carrier once, then peered inside. Pip stirred slightly, letting out a tiny mew. Leo froze for a moment, then chirped back softly. He stretched his neck forward, reaching his nose into the carrier opening, and gently touched Pip's head. Pip, perhaps recognizing the scent or sound of his father, mewed again, a little stronger this time. What happened next was quiet, undramatic, yet profoundly moving. Leo didn't try to pull Pip out or become agitated. Instead, after another soft chirp, he carefully backed away from the carrier and settled down on the rug directly in front of it, positioning himself between the carrier and the doorway facing outwards. He began to groom himself calmly, but his ears swiveled, constantly alert to every sound in the house, his body language radiating quiet protectiveness. He wasn't demanding, he was guarding. He had accepted that Pip was here, safe under Walter's roof, and he resumed his paternal role not with desperate pleas, but with a calm, steadfast presence. This quiet act of acceptance and renewed guardianship was the climax. The tension of how the reunion would unfold, whether Leo would accept the situation or remain aloof and distrustful, dissolved in this simple, powerful display of paternal devotion within the safety Walter provided. The weeks that followed settled into a new, demanding yet deeply rewarding routine for Walter. Caring for Pip required meticulous attention, careful bottle-feeding medications keeping him warm, monitoring his weight gain. Leo remained a constant presence, usually stationing himself near Pip's crate, or as Pip grew stronger and began exploring the study under Walter's supervision, following him at a watchful distance. He never interfered with Walter's care, but acted as a silent, furry bodyguard and companion. Slowly, Pip thrived. The combination of veterinary care, Walter's dedication, and perhaps Leo's comforting presence worked its magic. He began to eat more eagerly, gain weight, and his tiny personality started to emerge. Curious, playful, and remarkably trusting. He clearly adored his father, often curling up to sleep as close to Leo as the big tomcat would allow. Leo, too, began to change, secure with regular food, water, and shelter. Walter eventually let him come and go via a cat flap installed in the garage, but Leo chose to spend most of his time inside near Pip. His scarred face seemed to soften. He remained an independent spirit, not overly demanding of affection from Walter, but he sought proximity, often napping in the same room, and would occasionally grace Walter with a soft headbutt or a rumbling purr when his food bowl was filled. The bond between the three males, man, tomcat, and kitten, solidified into a quiet, comfortable companionship. Walter's solitary life was transformed. His neat house now bore the signs of pet ownership. Toys scattered in the study food bowls by the back door, a fine layer of orange fur on his favorite armchair. His routine was dictated by feeding schedules and kitten naps. His neighbors, initially surprised, grew accustomed to seeing Walter interacting gently with the two orange cats in his yard, his former reserve replaced by a quiet contentment. Mrs. Gable even brought over a homemade tuna casserole. "For you, Walter, not the cats," she'd clarified with a smile. He never knew exactly why Leo had chosen his door that night, whether it was random chance or some animal intuition. He never knew what happened to Pip's mother or any other siblings. But looking at Leo dozing peacefully in a patch of sunlight, while Pip playfully batted at his twitching tail, Walter knew his impulsive act of compassion had been profoundly right. He had spent a significant portion of his savings, disrupted his orderly life, and taken on a huge responsibility. In return, he had saved 2 lives and unexpectedly rescued himself from the quiet echo chamber of his own solitude. The unbelievable act wasn't just his initial intervention. It was the quiet miracle of the new family they had become.